Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something complex, if not slightly pungent. The medieval inn. This was where tired travelers met suspicious stew, where ale flowed freely, and so did lice, and where half your night was spent wondering whether that grown-up stairs was someone snoring or dying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's not so much that the innkeeper wakes up. It's that he is awakened by the gentle sound of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards below his room, followed by a groan, a crash, and the unmistakable clatter of a chicken escaping through the front door. Again, he opens one eye. It's still dark out, which means it's either too early or too late. There's no in-between in medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly, as if peeling himself off a loaf of bread, and rubs the sleep from his face with a sleeve that once resembled linen, but now has the texture of a worn saddlebag. His bed isn't bad, just simple a straw mattress, slightly slanted, with a blanket that smells faintly of garlic and last Tuesday's ale. Cozy in the way, a slightly damp cloak is cozy if you don't ask too many questions. He dresses in stages. First the tunic, then the trousers, then the belt if he can find it. After a brief search, he locates it hanging on a peg behind the door, along with a spoon, a candle nub, and someone's sock. He doesn't ask whose. Asking questions before sunrise is a mistake. Downstairs, the common room is quiet, unnervingly so. There are signs of life. A tipped mug, a boot near the hearth, a man snoring under a table with the confidence of someone who's done this before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests too early often leads to awkward sword-point discussions. He stokes the hearth with a practiced flick of the poker. The goal is warmth, not a roaring blaze. Firewood is expensive, and the last time he got a real blaze going, someone tried to cook a goose, on it indoors, with feathers still on. As he sets a pot over the flames, ready to reheat whatever last night's stew has evolved into, he hears the distant bray of a mule and the clump of early travelers arriving. He exhales. The inn isn't glamorous, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, it's his. And just like that, the day begins again. Breakfast at the inn is less of a meal and more of a negotiation between what's edible and what's legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something into a pot over the hearth. It doesn't have a name, but it does have a smell, somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot that's been thinking about cabbage. This is pottage, a medieval staple, not a recipe so much as a concept. Yesterday's pottage was made with barley and turnips. Today's includes those same turnips now softer, and some mysterious bits from a goose that failed to escape last night. Add water, heat, repeat. It's like soup if soup gave up halfway. The bread is present hard as a roof tile and just as chewable. It's cut with care, mostly because the innkeeper doesn't want to break another knife on it. Guests chew it slowly, partly for digestion, partly because there's time to reflect on their life choices between bites. And the ale, oh, yes, breakfast beer. It's not a medieval cliché, it's a necessity. The water here is questionable. The milk is reserved for the Lord's barn cat, and tea is still a twinkle in some fair-off merchant's eye. The ale is weak, but at least it's been boiled and filtered through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it, with supervision, of course. This is a reputable establishment, after all. By now, guests are drifting in, one by one. A merchant with a coin purse clutched like a holy relic. A sleepy pilgrim still clutching his walking stick and muttering about blisters. And inevitably, the bard who requests honey for his porridge, as though honey hasn't been locked in a chest for weeks. The barmaid agile and immune to nonsense moves between tables like a dancer who's had enough. She smiles at the patrons, refills mugs, and dodges unsolicited compliments with the grace of someone who has memorized every possible bad poem a drunk traveler can recite. By the end of breakfast, the inn smells like smoke barley and ambition. Empty bowls clatter onto tables. Stomachs are foolish. Spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, it's fillin', and nobody's died yet, which by medieval standards is a triumph. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of, it's people. Yet by mid-morning, they begin to pour in like pigeons, with luggage, and about the same regard for personal hygiene. First through the door is a knight, or rather someone claiming to be a knight. He has armor, yes, but it's mismatched rusty and held together with what looks like curtain rope. He demands a private room, despite having no coin, no manners, and the general scent of a horse that lost a bet. Behind him is a merchant's apprentice, who talks like he owns a fleet of ships, but pays with buttons. He tries to haggle over a bowl of soup, as though this establishment offers Groupon deals. Then comes the bard. Every inn has one. He never actually pays, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold. They aren't. He carries a lute, 6 strings, missing, and immediately launches into a mournful tune about lost love and goat theft. Nobody asked for this. A monk shuffles in next, nodding solemnly at everyone and blessing the furniture. He insists on fasting loudly while eyeing the bread. Within 10 minutes, he's eating said bread and explaining that technically it's not a sin if the loaf was already broken. By noon, the inn is full of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying their socks near the hearth. Someone else is sharpening a knife for no clear reason. A child runs between tables, pursued by a goose with a grudge. In the corner, 2 travelers argue over who gets the only stool, without a wobble, and overseeing it all is the innkeeper calm, as a monk, on payday. He's seen it all before. He knows that by evening, someone will fall in love. Someone will fall asleep in their soup, and someone will challenge a stool to a duel, probably the bard again. He pours another mug, wipes the counter with a cloth that has seen better centuries, and gives a nod to the barmaid, a silent agreement that despite everything, this place is still running. The guests may be unpredictable, loud occasionally bleating, but they're also what makes the inn, and he wouldn't have it any other way, except quieter and with fewer goose chases. If the inn has a soul, or at least a functioning brain, it's the barmaid. Her name is Marjorie. She's about 20, possibly 30, or maybe she just aged rapidly from exposure to traveling poets. No one knows for sure. What people do know is that the entire operation would collapse into a stew-soaked heap without her. She moves through the chaos with practiced precision, one hand balancing a tray of mugs, the other swatting a wandering hand that misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are faster than a ferret in a pantry. A drunken mercenary once tried to compliment her ankles and woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in 4 dialects, pour ale without spilling a drop, and insult a noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude, she's efficient, and in a building held together by splinters and half-promises, she is the only one with actual authority. She knows which travelers will pay in coin, and which will try to barter with seashells. She can sniff out a fake accent, a stolen ring, and a flirt disguised as a food complaint. The monk may mumble about sin, but even he knows. Marjorie is the patron saint of keeping things moving. Her day starts before dawn and ends long after the fire burns low. In that time, she'll serve stew, chase children, bandage a scraped knee, and somehow find time to refill every mug in the room, often while dodging falling cutlery or calming down an argument about who owns the goat that wandered in during lunch. And yet she never drops the tray. That's the magic of it. Marjorie doesn't run the inn on paper, but in practice, it's her kingdom. The innkeeper might own the walls, but she controls the floor. A wink here, a sharp word there, a stare that can curdle milk. It's a delicate dance, and she performs it daily, with the kind of grace that only comes from years of low expectations and high tolerance. Lunch at a medieval inn isn't so much a meal as it is a test of coordination, patience, and one's tolerance for noise that registers somewhere between festival and siege. It begins innocently enough. The hearth is warm, the stew is bubbling, and Marjorie rings the battered iron triangle that signals food is ready. A peaceful moment, brief immediately followed by stampede-level chaos. Guests emerge from corners you didn't know existed. A trader leaps over a sleeping dog. A bard swings his lute over one shoulder like he's marching into battle. 2 farmers argue over who sat down first, despite there being 6 empty benches and absolutely no one keeping score. The innkeeper ladles out steaming bowls of pottage, a dish whose exact ingredients are known only to the pot and possibly divine beings. It's hearty warm and completely flavorless, unless you count turnip as a flavor. One guest asks if it's vegetarian. Another asks what vegetarian means. The innkeeper pretends he doesn't hear either of them. Bread is handed out with the ceremonial thunk of something recently used as a doorstop. Diners attempt to dip it in their stew to soften it, resulting in several casualties to the bottoms of bowls. One man tries to trade his crust for a second helping of ale. It works. Marjorie weaves through the chaos, her tray loaded with mugs, and her eyes locked in that thousandy stare known only to battlefield nurses and women who've had to break up 2 arguments about seating etiquette before noon. She dole out food smiles and issues warnings all at once. A one-woman performance that deserves a round of applause, but will settle for a full tip jar. Somewhere near the hearth, a pair of guards is trying to out-burp each other, while a suspiciously cheerful monk hums a hymn between mouthfuls. The goat has returned again. It seems to enjoy the company. Lunch lasts about an hour, at least, according to the sun. Time inside the inn is measured by how long it takes for someone to spill ale on themselves, accuse someone else of cheating at dice, or attempt to sing with a mouthful of onion. And when it's over, there's silence, brief, eerie, until someone drops a spoon, and it all begins again. Lunch is over. The stew has been consumed. The bread has been gnawed. The goat has once again been escorted out with stern words and a broom. Now begins the part of the day innkeepers dread most. Cleaning up after the guests who swore they were very tidy. To the untrained eye, it may look like a normal dining room in mild disarray. But to Marjorie and the innkeeper, it's a full-blown archaeological dig site, complete with mysterious stains, lost personal items, and a deeply unsettling amount of onion peels in places onions should never have been. The wooden tables are wiped down with a cloth that, much like the innkeeper, has seen too much. It doesn't clean so much as smear everything into a nice medieval glaze. The floors are swept mostly by pushing things under benches and hoping gravity takes care of the rest. A boot is discovered under one of the stools. No one claims it. It's added to the growing pile behind the bar, labeled possibly belongs to someone. Marjorie starts collecting dishes with the speed and precision of someone who's done this every day for a decade and would very much like to stop. Guests who linger too long get the look, a glance so potent it once made a noble apologize, and tip an entire silver coin. He was never seen again, but the story remains legend. The stew pot is scraped clean. Whatever remains is either fed to the pigs or quietly reincorporated into tomorrow's recipe. Waste not, want not, especially when nobody can tell the difference after the third bowl. The innkeeper mutters something about washing the mugs, but everyone knows he'll just rinse them in the rain barrel and call it divine purification. There is a bucket for soaking, but it's mostly ceremonial at this point. As the final crumbs are brushed away and the benches are set back in place, somehow always wobblier than before, the room starts to resemble an inn again, rather than the scene of a particularly well-fed riot. Marjorie takes a breath, straightens her apron, and prepares for the next wave. Because in a medieval inn, peace is never permanent. It's just the brief pause between one mess and the next. And somewhere, someone is already asking when supper will be ready. Just as the last bowl is stacked, the last spoon dried is, and Marjorie dares to take a sip of leftover ale in peace. It happens. The door cracks open. New guests, fresh faces, fresh problems, and worst of all questions. The first traveler steps in wearing an oversized cloak, a beard that could house several woodland creatures, and an expression that suggests he's about to review the place on parchment. He walks up to the bar and asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" The silence is immediate and total. Somewhere in the corner, a stool cocks under the weight of collective judgment. Behind him arrives a young couple, clearly not married, based on how closely they're standing and how determined they are not to touch, who ask if they can see the room first. Marjorie simply points upstairs. It's wooden. It has walls. It doesn't leak in summer. Usually a third guest covered in dust and self-importance insists on knowing where the inn sources its candles, whether the stew is ethically prepared, and if the goat has been trained to stay outside. The goat, of course, enters at that exact moment and promptly sneezes on his boots. Then there's the bard, a different bard, this time, who insists on paying with a song. He plucks his lute hits 3 wrong notes in a row and launches into a ballad about the lady in the leaky chamber pot. He is immediately asked to stop politely with a broom. The innkeeper nods his way through every request, every complaint, and every mispronounced question about wine varieties. There's one wine, and it's reddish. He doesn't argue. He doesn't correct. He simply listens, smiles, and lets Marjorie handle it. Because if there's one thing that fills an inn faster than rain, it's travelers with opinions, and they never arrive quietly. By sundown, the common room is a patchwork of personalities. The quiet scribe in the corner, the arguing merchants near the fire, the bard on his second attempt at winning affection through volume, and the goat now asleep under table 3. The innkeeper exhales. Another batch of guests, another round of small disasters waiting to unfold. And all of them somehow think they're the normal ones. Supper time arrives not with elegance, but with noise. Loud overlapping noise. Chairs scrape, mugs clink. Someone coughs theatrically to hint that they've been waiting ages, even though they arrived 9 minutes ago and are still wearing their traveling cloak like it's a crown. Marjorie emerges from the kitchen, holding a pot that's technically still warm and definitely still stew. The day's menu hasn't changed. It's still the inn's signature dish. Whatever was left from earlier slightly reheated. It's served with a chunk of bread that could double as a blunt weapon and a side of commentary from the guests. This stew tastes different than last night, one traveler says with suspicion. It's the same stew, Marjorie replies without looking up. Oh well, it's nice, they add quickly, now fearing for their cutlery privileges. The bard, who is still here, somehow offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl, with a little more enthusiasm than necessary. He gets the message. Over near the hearth, 2 merchants are having a lively debate about grain prices, which is somehow louder than the couple arguing about how many fleas they counted on the bed upstairs. The goat has returned. It is now under the table, again, being quietly fed by a child who insists it's his emotional livestock. The stew is filling. The ale flows freely, which helps with how filling the stew is. And despite the occasional complaint about texture temperature or the existential ambiguity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly clean since last harvest, watching his patrons with the expression of a man who has accepted his fate. He knows that in about an hour, someone will spill something. Someone else will fall asleep mid-sentence, and the bard will try again. He always tries again, but for now, the room is loud, messy, and very much alive, which is, if nothing else, a sign of success. Because in a medieval inn, supper doesn't need to be good. It just needs to arrive without catching fire. As the last spoon clinks against the bottom of a bowl, and guests begin to lean back, with the satisfied groans of people who survived another round of stew, the real show begins. Evening entertainment loosely defined. There is no scheduled program, no flyers, no host, with a lute and a schedule. The evening simply unfolds the way all great performances do, with no structure-limited talent and a strong chance of mild injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment. He clears his throat, dramatically plucks 3 uncertain strings, and announces a ballad titled The Fair Lady of Festerwell, Who Married a Troll. Half the room cheers, the other half groans. The goat sneezes. His voice is enthusiastic. The lyrics rhyme occasionally. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply, the way a man does, when he knows there are still 6 verses to go, and at least one of them will involve sock theft. Meanwhile, at the far table, 2 old friends are trying to best each other in a slurred riddle contest. The rules are unclear. One of the riddles might actually be a recipe. A nearby monk politely covers his ears and starts humming psalms at a volume typically reserved for church bells. The dice come out next. Wooden chipped and possibly blessed or cursed. Opinions vary. A small crowd gathers as bets are made using coins, buttons a very old pair, and one man's left shoe. Nobody questions it. The pair's value is disputed. Marjorie circles the room like a falcon with excellent hearing. She's watching for trouble, spilled, and anyone who looks like they're about to stand on a table. She catches the bard mid-step just as he tries to perform a dramatic gesture on a bench leg that clearly wasn't designed for theater. In the corner, a shy traveler shyly produces a flute. It produces 3 lovely notes before the goat headbutts him. Applause all around. Evening entertainment at the inn isn't polished rehearsed or even entirely legal in some towns, but it's real. It's loud. And it almost always ends with someone snoring into their mug or waking up with a new tattoo drawn in soot. There is no official closing time at the inn. There's no bell, no lights out announcement, and certainly no polite usher guiding guests toward the door. No closing time is more of a gradual societal collapse. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience. This usually happens when he forgets the lyrics to the final verse and replaces them with dramatic throat noises. Someone throws a crust of bread in appreciation. It's unclear whether it's applause or a bribe to stop. Next, a few patrons start to slump, not from ale necessarily, but from sheer caloric weight. The stew has settled. Gravity has won. One merchant leans so far back on his stool that he becomes furniture. His companion uses him as a footrest. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs like she's building a small fortress. She doesn't say much, just raises one eyebrow, which in the language of innkeeping means wrap it up or start sweeping. There's always one guest who insists on ordering something after the hearth has gone dark. Tonight, it's a peddler who thinks a light snack means a full roast duck. He has given bread a look and a firm suggestion to chew slowly and sleep sooner. The goat ever present has curled up by the embers. It is technically not allowed indoors, but at this point it's paid more attention during story hour than half the humans, so exceptions are made. The innkeeper begins his rounds. He pokes at the dying fire checks that no one has passed out, face down in the stew pot again, and gently nudges a snoring traveler off a table and onto a bench. A professional move learned through years of subtle repositioning. One couple heads upstairs, bumping into every visible surface. They will by morning complain about the noise. The irony is noted and filed away for later passive-aggressive amusement. Eventually, the room empties. Not all at once, but in soft, wobbly waves, like a tide of cloaks yawns, and the occasional hiccup. The chatter fades. The laughter dies down. The inn grows quiet. Sort of. A mug rolls off a table. Someone upstairs drops a boot. The goat sigh deeply. But for now, the worst of the day is over. The guests are asleep, or at least horizontal, and no longer speaking. Climbing the stairs in a medieval inn is an act of faith. Not spiritual faith, structural. The steps creak groan and occasionally shift underfoot, like they're considering early retirement. But for the weary traveler, upstairs means one thing: a place to collapse. The rooms vary. Some are private if you're wealthy or convincingly loud about it. Most, however, are shared dormitory-style arrangements where strangers sleep mere inches apart, and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw and dreams. Blankets, if you're lucky. Pillows only if you brought your own, or creatively folded your cloak. And yes, the straw rustles, constantly. Sometimes because it's dry. Sometimes because something inside it is also trying to sleep. Snoring is inevitable. Someone always starts within moments of lying down. Not light, adorable snoring. We're talking medieval snoring. The kind that echoes off wooden beams and makes you question if there's a wild boar in the rafters. One guest tosses in his sleep. Another talks. One hums a hymn through his nose, which is deeply unsettling. Privacy as a concept does not exist. You can pull your cloak over your head, but that only muffles the sounds of someone in the next bed, loudly discussing dreams involving fish and taxes. Someone else keeps getting up to check on the stew, which is just code for needing the chamber pot located discreetly behind a curtain that fools no one. Speaking of which, yes, the chamber pot. It's there. It's full. It's everyone's problem. It's also someone's footrest until they realize their mistake too late. Occasionally, someone stumbles in, after dark, unsure of which bed is theirs, and prepared to argue about it. Arguments are brief, muffled by exhaustion, and typically settled by whoever has the larger boots or stronger odor. And yet, despite the noises, the smells, the suspicious straw, and the shared air, there's something oddly comforting about it. A dozen people, all from different places, sleeping under the same crooked beams, snoring in harmony. Upstairs isn't peaceful, but it's safe warmish, and with luck, mostly free of goats, which at this hour of night counts as luxury. It's late. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. The common room is finally still, except for the occasional creak, the kind that makes you wonder if the building is settling or if something alive is navigating the beams. Either way, it's time for the innkeeper's midnight patrol. This ritual isn't written anywhere, but every innkeeper knows it. It involves a candlestick, an exhausted sigh, and a silent prayer that no one has died, started a fire, or sleepwalked into the pantry again. The tour begins downstairs. The benches are mostly empty. The mugs are half drunk, half spilled, and possibly fermenting into something new. A spoon floats in the ale barrel. The innkeeper doesn't want to know how or why. He checks the doors, front and back, both bolted, probably, maybe. The front one tends to swing open during high winds or emotional conversations. He props a bucket in front of it, just in case. Behind the counter, he counts the coins from the day's trade. Most of it is real currency. Some of it is Button's carved bones. And once again, that same old pair. He places it in the undecided value bowl. Next stop upstairs. He tiptoes like a man sneaking through a nest of mildly drunk wolves. Each floorboard betrays him, with a creak louder than the last. Behind one door, someone snores with conviction. Behind another, someone mumbles about taxes in their sleep. He peeks into the shared room, a sea of limbs and cloaks. One guest is sleeping upside down. Another has tucked themselves under the bed like a human storage box. The chamber pot is full, as always. Then comes the weird part of the patrol. Things that shouldn't be moving. A broom has fallen over again. The candle flickers, despite no draft. He hears the unmistakable sound of a lute string being plucked, even though the bard went to bed 2 hours ago or was tied to the wagon outside. Depends who you ask. And of course, the goat is missing again. The innkeeper exhales. Everything is by this inn's standards fine. He descends the stairs, blows out the candle, and mutters, "If anything catches fire, let it be the bad stew." It's the middle of the night, and technically everyone is asleep, but let's not pretend it's restful. The shared upstairs room hums like a beehive of human discomfort. Snoring is the dominant sound, layered, textured, and deeply unmusical. One guest snores in short bursts like a hiccuping squirrel. Another goes for volume, vibrating the rafters with every exhale. It's like a symphony of sleep apnea. Someone talks in their sleep, mostly about carrots. Another keeps whispering, "No, my lord," in a tone that suggests either a bad dream or a romantic misunderstanding. A boot falls with a thud onto the floor. Nobody moves, not even the goat, now snuggled beneath someone's cloak like it owns the place. The bed frames creak in protest every time someone rolls over, which happens often as straw mattresses are not known for their ergonomic support. In fact, if you're not stabbed by a twig in the first 5 minutes, the bed is probably haunted. Then there's the heat. With so many bodies in one room, the temperature climbs to barn in summer. Cloaks are shed, blankets kicked, and someone decides to open the shuttered window, immediately letting in a breeze and the local owl who now refuses to leave. The smell. It's what one might politely call robust. A fragrant blend of stew, digestion, unwashed socks, warm goat, and the vague ghost of ale. It would be unbearable if everyone weren't already too tired to care. Occasionally, someone wakes up, convinced it's morning. It's not. It's just darker than before. And now there's an owl watching. They stumble out of bed, step on someone's hand, and are shushed back into place with a grunt. Marjorie sleeps in the back room, ear-rained, to pick up anything alarming, raised voices, sudden crashes, or lute music after hours. So far, so good. Mostly. And downstairs, the innkeeper snoozes behind the bar, in a chair shaped exactly like his spine. He holds a mug he didn't finish. He dreams of silence. He will not get it. Because in a medieval inn, sleep comes in short shifts, shared spaces, and suspicious warmth. But still, everyone's horizontal. That's considered victory. At the first hint of light, that faint murky gray, that could be dawn, or just an optimistic moon. The inn begins to stir, not gracefully, more like a barn full of animals that have realized someone forgot to lock the door. Feet hit the floor with varying degrees of commitment. Someone groans dramatically, as if waking up was unexpected and entirely unfair. Another guest immediately begins searching for their missing boot. It's on the hearth. No one knows how. The goat does, but he's not telling. The shared room empties in waves. The early risers, merchants, monks, and anyone with a guilty conscience creep out first. They leave behind a mess of wrinkled blankets, muddy footprints, and one still sleeping traveler who insists, even in dreams, that he didn't touch the cheese. Downstairs, the innkeeper is already awake. Technically, his eyes are open. His body is upright, but his soul is still halfway between this world and wherever old barkeepers go in their dreams somewhere, with clean mugs and quiet guests. Marjorie arrives moments later, wrapped in a shawl and sheer determination. She begins her silent inventory of overnight damage. 2 overturned stools, 1 missing candle, and someone inexplicably put jam on the broom handle. Questions start immediately. Has anyone seen my satchel? Did I pay last night? Is this my goat? To each, Marjorie offers the same response. A slow blink followed by a flat maybe. Then comes the denials. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't the one snoring. I never said that about the monk's sandals. Everyone denies everything loudly, even when confronted with direct evidence, like a ladle stuck in someone's belt or a half-eaten turnip in their boot. The bard reappears, blur-eyed, and declaring he has written a new verse about the night's events. He is promptly offered a bowl of porridge and told to eat quietly. For once, he complies. Breakfast is served, stew is reheated, ale is poured, life continues. By the time the sun fully rises, most guests have either paid or bartered their way out. Some leave sheepishly. Others stride off, proudly convinced they were charming. But one truth remains. Nobody ever admits what happened after supper. The guests have trickled out. The goat has been escorted again, and Marjorie is scraping something unidentifiable off a bench with the focus of a surgeon and the face of a woman, reconsidering every life choice that led her here. The common room is quiet now, not peaceful, just taking a breath. A few embers crackle in the hearth. The floor is sticky. One bench lists slightly to the left, either from misuse or protest. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, cradling a mug of the morning's first ale like it's a family heirloom. He gazes across the room and mutters the same thing he mutters every morning. Well, that wasn't too bad. It was, of course, but optimism helps digestion. Marjorie walks past with a tray of used spoons, a frayed cloth, and the look of someone who will not be answering questions before sunrise tomorrow. She refills the stew pot with water salt and faith and begins stirring. Breakfast will happen as always. Outside, a cart rattles by. A rooster announces its existence. Somewhere in the village, a smith hammers something unreasonably loud for this hour. And just like that, the world is awake again. And with the world come new guests. The inn's door opens. A farmer steps in, dragging a sack of something possibly vegetable. Behind him, a woman with a travel cloak and the polite smile of someone about to complain about prices, and naturally a knight with a dented helmet and no indoor voice. They look around. Nods are exchanged. Coins change hands. Questions are asked. Answers are vague. The cycle begins again. The innkeeper takes a sip. Marjorie reties her apron. A chair is righted. A mug is filled. A stranger sits down and immediately asks if there's a vegan option. The inn doesn't change much. The stew stays mysterious. The guests remain unpredictable. The goat, one suspects, has a spare key. And yet, despite the noise, the mess, and the deeply suspicious smells, they always come back. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, the chaos. Or maybe it's the only place in town where your mistakes get swept up with the crumbs and nobody asks questions before breakfast. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake and just as flat. But don't let geography fool you. This modest patch of reclaimed swamp was about to punch far above its weight. While the rest of Europe was busy stabbing each other over religion, and whose king had the shinier boots, the Dutch quietly built an empire of light money and oil paint. It started with a revolution. Spain had been bossing the Netherlands around for decades, waving the Catholic flag and squeezing taxes out of every fish and tulip bulb. But by 1648, after nearly 80 years of kicking and screaming, the Dutch finally declared, "We're done." And just like that, they were free. What followed was less of a national plan and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring. Amsterdam became the Wall Street of Europe. Its ports were crowded with ships headed to Asia, Africa, the Americas, anywhere with goods to trade or people to exploit. The Dutch East India Company, basically, the Amazon Prime of the 17th century, made fortunes off nutmeg porcelain, and let's not forget colonization. But the real twist, while their ships were hauling cinnamon across oceans back home, people were reading newspapers, sipping beer, and watching their neighbors get immortalized in oil by guys named Rembrandt and Vermeer. These painters didn't just make portraits, they made legends. Vermeer captured quiet, intimate moments lit like divine cinema. Rembrandt gave old men and biblical figures more drama than a reality show. Art wasn't just for kings anymore. Merchants wanted portraits too. Even butchers could afford a nice still life with a pig's head and a lemon. Tasteful. And then there were the tulips. Oh yes, the infamous tulip mania, a brief but spectacular episode where people sold entire houses just to own a flower bulb. One bulb. The market crashed harder than a drunk sailor. But by then, the Dutch had already established their reputation. Wildly successful, slightly unhinged, and never boring. So, how did a tiny damp republic become the envy of Europe by mastering the sea, the stock market, and the self-portrait? And this was just the beginning. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the docks. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delfted. These weren't just cities. They were launch pads for global domination with sails and spreadsheets. While France was polishing its wigs and Spain was still counting its gold, the Dutch were busy inventing capitalism, one log book at a time. Their secret weapon, the merchant fleet. At its peak, the Dutch had more ships than any other nation on earth, more than England, more than Spain, possibly more than common sense should allow. But these weren't just fishing boats with attitude. These were armed merchant ships, sleek and practical, loaded with cannon and cargo space. They carried everything. Silk from China, spices, from Indonesia, sugar from Brazil, and occasionally a cannonball to the face if pirates showed up. The Dutch East India Company, also known by its terrifying acronym VOC, was the world's first multinational corporation. Shareholders, stock markets, dividends. Yes, it was capitalism, before it was cool or even ethical. The VOC did whatever it took to protect profit. Fortresses, private armies, and let's not sugarcoat it, some rather ruthless colonial tactics. The spice trade wasn't just cutthroat, it was decapitation, friendly. And while the VOC was ruling the East, the West India Company was handling things in the Atlantic. Think sugar rum and slavery. The Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not just incidental. It was systemic, calculated, and profitable. The same country commissioning paintings of milkmaids was also trading human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underside. Yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes. Their cargoes were cataloged. Their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well insured. If there was ever a nation that could ship tulips, cheese, and gunpowder in the same boat without confusing the labels, it was the Dutch. They weren't just navigating oceans. They were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers, the Dutch sent accountants with musketses. Their empire wasn't just built with swords. It was built with balance sheets. And somehow, amid the maritime hustle, their little republic kept thriving. Next, we zoom into the velvet-lit world of Vermeer, where everyday life became eternal, while Dutch ships hauled goods across continents and trading companies turned quarterly profits into golden chandeliers. Something else was happening. Quietly, almost silently, in the towns and homes of the Dutch Republic, a girl poured milk. A woman laced her pearls. A letter was read in silence beside an open window. And with every mundane moment, a man named Johannes Vermeer turned ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer wasn't the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he wasn't even the busiest. He produced a grand total of about 35 known works. That's less than what Rembrandt spilled on the floor during a single bad week. But what Vermeer lacked in volume, he made up for in radiance. His paintings are calm, composed, and eerily luminous, like someone painted sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? Precision, detail, and a near mystical understanding of light. The interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds. They were characters. You could almost hear the creak of the wooden floors and the ticking of a clock. And that's the secret of the Dutch Golden Age. While the outside world raced forward, artists like Vermeer captured the sacredness of slowness. Of course, Vermeer's magic wasn't performed in a vacuum. This was a society that adored images. The average Dutch home in the 17th century had more paintings on the walls than forks in the kitchen drawer. Landscapes, portraits, still-lived ships, cows, and a generous number of dead fish arranged on tables. They loved it all. Why? Because this was a middle-ass country. Merchants, bakers, and brewers had money and taste. They didn't want cherubs floating in clouds. They wanted something that looked like their world, but slightly better lit. And the painters delivered. Dutch art became an industry, fast detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Vermeer. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout, they whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about intimacy, solitude, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. In the next chapter, we'll step out of these golden-lit rooms and into the streets of a booming republic. Because outside Vermeer's windows, an economic experiment was brewing that would both dazzle and implode. The infamous tulip mania. Picture this. You walk into a pub in 1636. You're just a regular Dutch citizen, maybe a baker or a cheese merchant. A man next to you offers to sell you a tulip bulb. Not a bouquet, just one bulb. The price, the same as your house. And the crazy part, you consider it. Welcome to tulip mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, and possibly the world's first recorded financial bubble. The Dutch didn't invent flowers, of course, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare striped varieties caused by a virus that oddly made them more desirable, became status symbols. Owning a unique tulip bulb was like driving a Ferrari today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally made soup out of it. At first, it was just wealthy collectors dabbling, but soon everyone wanted in. Farmers, barbers, chimney sweeps. If you could hold a coin and had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire savings were spent. Futures contracts were created. People traded rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed yet. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed. For a brief, dazzling moment, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then came the crash. One February day in 1637, people stopped buying. Maybe they blinked and realized they were mortgaging homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a tulip and thought, wait, that's it. Prices collapsed, fortunes vanished, and suddenly, that one bulb, you paid the price of a canal house for worthless. You might as well plant it and try to enjoy the view. Strangely enough, the Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was embarrassing. Yes, there were lawsuits. There were public sermons about greed and vanity. But the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. It wasn't their last brush with speculative mania, just the prettiest one. Tulip mania became a moral tale about hubris irrational markets and the human tendency to chase beauty until it bites. But while the bulbs rotted, the Dutch spirit didn't. Because just around the corner, the Republic was building a cultural empire on books, maps, and ideas. And that's where we head next. While tulips were being traded like gold, and Vermeer was busy painting women doing very quiet things, near windows, something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic: the mind. The Dutch didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas. And in the 17th century, that was dangerous business. Let's start with printing presses. At a time when publishing the wrong opinion in, say, Spain, could get unaidly burned at the stake, the Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't mess with trade, which meant books flowed out of Amsterdam, like wine, at a merchant banquet. Ideas banned elsewhere found safe harbor here. Descartes wrote and published in the Netherlands. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher who suggested that maybe God wasn't an old man in the sky, but something more like reality itself, lived and thought here in relative peace, until he became too radical even for the radicals. Universities like Leiden and Utrecht became intellectual magnets. Students from across Europe came to study everything from law and medicine to the latest theories in optics and anatomy. And because this was the Dutch, they studied in buildings clean enough to eat off and catalog their knowledge with terrifying precision. Syggraphy also thrived. Dutch map makers like Joan Belleo were not just sketching coastlines. They were redrawing the European imagination. Their atlases were masterpieces, decorative, wildly inaccurate, in parts but astonishingly detailed for their time. Want to explore the coast of Java or dream about Brazil? Just open a Dutch map. This intellectual curiosity wasn't limited to scholars. The middle class read audaciously pamphlets, travelogue scientific treatises, and scandalous poetry. Newspapers circulated stories from Constantinople to the New World. For the first time in European history, literacy wasn't a luxury. It was a lifestyle. But it wasn't all enlightenment and espresso. These ideas stirred the pot. Religious tensions simmered. Philosophers were censored. Some books were quietly banned. The Dutch tolerated a lot. But even tolerance has its limits when prophets start messing with property law. Still, for a republic of just a few million people, the Dutch punched far above their weight in shaping modern thought. And speaking of shaping next, we turn to the architectural boom that transformed their cities into Baroque Lego sets of brick canals and proud gables. Imagine a city built like a painting. Straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place, even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century. A masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities, they drained them into existence. Much of the land the Republic stood on was technically underwater or had been recently persuaded not to be. With dikes, pumps, and sheer willpower, the Dutch reshaped their world. Where other nations saw swamp, they saw potential real estate. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring of Amsterdam, known as the Grafton Gordel. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close as urban planning gets to poetry. Concentric canals carved the city into districts. Goods moved by boat, not cart. Rich merchants built narrow houses with steep steps and grand windows, showing off just enough wealth to impress, but not enough to look French. Those tall houses with the ornate gables, they weren't just aesthetic choices. They were tax strategies. Property taxes were based on width, not height. So people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance. The result, an architectural skyline that looks like gingerbread real estate and smells faintly of Calvinist restraint. Brick was the material of choice. It was cheap, durable, and made the streets look like a Renaissance Minecraft server. But design wasn't only about beauty. The Dutch emphasized utility. Even their ornate facades had winches and pulleys to lift furniture up through windows, since spiral staircases inside were less stately and more claustrophobia simulator. Public buildings also bloomed. Town halls, Way's guild halls. The grandest of them all, Amsterdam's town hall, finished in 1655. It was so magnificent that Louis XIV reportedly called it the eighth wonder of the world, and promptly copied it, as was his habit. And amid all this architectural splendor, there was a message. The Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about cities, citizens, and civic pride. Clean streets, tidy facades, order, and elegance. This was a built environment that reflected a national mindset, precise, practical, and quietly proud. But beneath this order, tensions simmered. Political divisions, religious strife, and international rivals were gathering. In the next chapter, we dive into the conflicts, internal and external, that would test the very seams of this golden republic. For all its brilliance, the Dutch Golden Age wasn't some utopia of harmony and polite cheese tasting. Behind the tulips and oil paintings lay a republic built on tension, political, religious, and increasingly military. First, the politics. The Dutch Republic wasn't really a republic in the modern sense. It was a jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its rights, like a toddler hoarding snacks. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class in cities like Amsterdam and Leiden. These men weren't nobles, but they had the money to pretend. At the top of the political pyramid was the stadtholder, usually from the House of Orange, a military leader with just enough power to make everyone nervous. Think of him as a monarch with a disclaimer. Some provinces liked him. Others liked him less. The result, a constant tug-of war between centralized leadership and provincial independence. A sort of political group project where half the group wants to fire the leader and the other half is the leader's cousin. Religiously, the Dutch had technically broken with Catholicism, but that didn't mean unity. The Calvinists were in charge, and they weren't exactly famous for their open-mindedness. Other Protestants, Jews, and Catholics were tolerated, as long as they didn't cause a fuss, build big churches, or throw parades. Publicly, everything was orderly. Privately, it was tense. Internationally, the Dutch were suddenly a major power, and the old guard didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant pals, now saw them as economic rivals. Cue the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of naval brawls, where both sides lost ship's pride, and occasionally their tempers. The Dutch held their own thanks to admirals like Michel de Ruyter, who was equal parts pirate strategist and national hero. He once sailed up the Tempalmes and stole the English flagship for fun. But warfare is expensive, maintaining fleets, defending trade routes, and bribing neighbors not to attack. All this added strain to a delicate system. And while the Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show, not in the art or the architecture, but in the very system that built it. Next, we'll visit the twilight of this era and ask, how does a Golden Age end? With a crash, a war, or simply a yawn from history? Golden Ages don't typically end with explosions. More often, they fade quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left and someone just knocked over the wine. The Dutch Republic in the late 1600s wasn't collapsing, it was sighing. The signs were subtle at first. Trade remained strong, but competitors were catching up. The English and French were getting better at naval warfare and even better at copying Dutch business models. The English created their own East India Company, threw in some colonial ambition, and added the one thing the Dutch didn't have: a monarchy with a flair for self-promotion. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive, very aggressive. He wasn't content with verses and fancy shoes. He wanted borders power, and maybe a few Dutch cities while he was at it. The resulting wars were brutal and expensive. The Dutch won a few, lost a few more, and bled money throughout. Domestically, the Republic had another problem: boredom. Innovation slowed. Painters stopped painting radical new ideas and started repeating what sold. Rows of cowships and sleepy windmills. Art became safe. Banking became cautious. The canal houses were still pretty, but the energy had shifted. You could feel the flicker in the oil lamp. There were deeper fractures, too. The divide between the House of Orange and the Republican regents deepened. The middle class, once the engine of prosperity, began to stagnate. Tensions brewed between old money and new ambition, and most importantly, young Dutch people stopped believing they were at the center of the world because they weren't anymore. The final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in wind. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's financial and naval superpower. France stole the stage in art and science until the guillotine got involved. And the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged out of the spotlight. But the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age never disappeared. It lived on in libraries, in galleries, in legal codes, and shipping routes. The world they helped shape didn't forget them. They just stopped being the main character. Next, in our final chapter, we explore the lasting impact of this remarkable era and how a tiny republic changed the course of the modern world. Though the curtain fell on the Dutch Golden Age, its echoes have never truly stopped. The 17th century republic might have lost its global dominance, but it left fingerprints on everything, from economics to art to how we imagine freedom itself. Let's start with capitalism. The Dutch didn't invent money trade or greed, but they streamlined them with breathtaking efficiency. They created the world's first stock exchange, pioneered shareholder capitalism, and made financial instruments that are still used today. If you've ever cursed your mutual fund or stared blankly at a line graph, you have Dutch merchants to thank. They also revolutionized global commerce, not just through ships, but through systems. Insurance record keeping, double entry, bookkeeping all sharpened to near perfection in Amsterdam. And while they certainly weren't saints, hello, colonialism, they were logistical geniuses. They made trade scalable, predictable, global. In the arts, their influence is immortal. Vermeer's quiet light, Rembrandt's stormy faces, the intimate realism of domestic scenes. These became the visual grammar of Western art. Their paintings taught us that greatness didn't require gods and swords. Sometimes it was a woman pouring milk caught in a moment of stillness. In ideas, they carved out a space for reason. The Dutch tolerance, imperfect but notable, allowed thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes to publish works that would have been burned elsewhere. In doing so, they helped push Europe toward the Enlightenment. Freedom of thought, religious pluralism, scientific curiosity all took root in the Dutch soil. Even their cities set a standard. Amsterdam's canals, Utrecht's universities, the brick gables and clean navigable streets all served as templates for modern urban life. Order without opulence, function dressed in elegance. They didn't build for kings, they built for citizens. And perhaps that's the heart of it. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't about empires or cathedrals or divine right. It was about what a small, determined, soggy republic could achieve with brains grit and slightly obsessive bookkeeping. It didn't last forever. Golden ages never do. But in the brief glow of that century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success, one powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks to them, the modern world sails in their wake, charting new waters on maps they helped draw. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. No referees in polos, no timers, no slow motion replays, just dust, sweat, and a sacred olive tree. The year was 776 BCE CE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary in the Peloponnese, dedicated to none other than Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, an apparent enthusiast for athletic thighs. But these weren't just local games to pass the time between harvests. They were sacred religious, even. The ancient Greeks didn't separate worship from physical excellence. In their eyes, competing naked, in the heat of the Greek sun, wasn't just showing off. It was divine devotion. To test the limits of your body in front of Zeus was the ultimate offering, one far more acceptable than sacrificing goats or writing hymns in hexameter. The origins of the games are a mythological mess. Some say Hercules founded them after cleaning out the Orgian stables, which frankly sounds like the sort of event you'd want to turn into something else. Others say King Pelops. Yes, the same guy with the cursed descendants started them after winning a chariot race. But whatever the story, by 776 BCE, the games were officially recorded and already prestigious. The first recorded event, the stadium, a short-foot race, roughly 600 ft long, or one stayed. The only known victor that year was a cook named Coro Boss of Elis. That's right. The first Olympic champion was a guy who probably trained by running between kitchens and slicing goat meat. He didn't get a trophy. He got an olive wreath, eternal glory, and the right to have poems written about his thighs. All competitors were Greek male and citizens. No women allowed to compete, or even watch, unless they were priestesses. Married women, caught sneaking in, risked being hurled off a cliff, which feels a bit extreme, even by ancient standards. But despite the simplicity, the stakes were enormous. To win an Olympia wasn't just a personal triumph. It brought glory to your polis, your city-state. You were no longer just a man. You were a hero. And heroes in ancient Greece lived forever. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single-foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one guy sprinting 600 FT turned into a sprawling schedule of events that tested every aspect of the male body. Speed, strength, balance, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics. Running. After the stadium, more races were added. The Dios was essentially the ancient 400-meter dash. One length of the track there, one back. Then came the Dikos, a long distance race that could last up to 24 laps. That's over 5 kilometers in the Greek summer sun, naked. No water breaks, no music playlists, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that. Wrestling or pale was a technical affair. No biting or eye gouging, but pretty much everything else was fair game. You had to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pankration, a mix of boxing and wrestling where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokes. It was violent, raw, and beloved. The rules try not to kill your opponent, at least not in front of the judges. Boxing, called pygmachia, was brutal. No gloves, just leather straps wrapped around the knuckles. Matches often ended in blood and broken bones, and surrender was the only way out. It was less float, like a butterfly, and more survive with your teeth. Then there was the pentathlon, a 5-event spectacle for the ultimate all-rounder. It included running, wrestling, long jump, javelin, and discus. The long jump was done with weights called halter, supposedly to add momentum, which sounds more like a tripping hazard than an athletic boost. And finally, chariot racing. Held in the hippodromium, it was fast, dangerous, and occasionally fatal. The interesting twist, the owners of the horses won the prize, not the drivers. So some aristocrat could pay a stable boy to risk his life for glory and still take home the olive wreath. Classic. Each event pushed men to their limits and sometimes past them. But they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something even more valuable in ancient Greece. Kleos, eternal fame. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening biceps in front of the crowd. They were first and foremost an act of worship. The athletes weren't simply competitors. They were pilgrims. And Olympia, that wasn't just an arena. It was a sacred site dedicated to the king of the gods, himself, Zeus. Nestled in a lush grove called the Altis Olympia was more temple than stadium. Before a single race was run or a discus was hurled, the sacred atmosphere had to be honored. The most important structure, the Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed a gigantic ivory and gold statue of the god sculpted by Phidias. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And yes, it absolutely loomed over the games like a divine referee. The rituals began days before the competitions. Athletes took oaths before a statue of Zeus Halios Zeus of the oaths, swearing not to cheat, bribe, or bite during wrestling. Breaking that vow wasn't just poor sportsmanship, it was sacrilege. Cheaters were fined and their penalties paid. For bronze statues of Zeus that lined the entrance path, eternal reminders of their shame. And then there were the sacrifices. Lots of them. Dozens of bulls were slaughtered at the altar of Zeus. The smoke, the chanting, the blood. It was all part of a massive communal offering. The meat was cooked and shared among spectators and priests, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was central to the ceremony, a sacred flame believed to have been lit by the rays of the sun, burned at the altar of Hestia. This tradition inspired the modern Olympic flame, though thankfully without the animal sacrifice. Spectators, athletes, judges, they didn't just come for sport. They came for religious renewal, for a chance to witness divine favor manifest through human excellence. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you didn't pray hard enough. And at night, with the contest done, and the altars still warm, Olympia glowed with music, feasting, and philosophy. It was worship festival and spectacle all in one. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, we hope you were Greek male and very, very nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules strict, the requirements intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be freeborn Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners, not even women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states across the Greek world, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond. But only if they could prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was more than paperwork. It was a birthright. And without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was standard. Why, for one, the Greeks believed the human body, particularly the male body, was the physical expression of divine perfection. Also, it made cheating harder. No secret weapons, no armor, and no hiding behind flashy gear. Just you, your muscles, and maybe a very unfortunate sunburn. Training wasn't optional. Athletes had to prove they'd been preparing for 10 months prior and undergo a final month of supervised training at Olympia itself. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a brutal regimen of running, grappling, and tossing heavy things until you resembled a marble statue minus the helpful plinth. Now, about women, they were banned from competing, and in most cases, from even watching. A married woman caught attending could be thrown off Mount Typeon. Exceptions were made only for unmarried women, particularly priestesses, like the priestess of Data, who had front row seats as part of her religious office. But don't worry, women had their own games. The Heron Games, honoring the goddess Hera, with foot races for girls and young women, fully clothed. Of course, age categories existed, boys, youths, and men. But you still had to be ready to take a punch from someone twice your size, and there were no weight classes. Wrestling a guy the size of a temple column. Tough luck, kid. Zeus decides the outcome. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were of athletic prowess, proud, patriarchal, and meticulously regulated. To the casual observer, the ancient Olympic Games might seem like a wholesome celebration of athleticism and divine devotion. But beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches was something far more strategic politics. Because in ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The Games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the polis, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international PR. Athens might build temples, and Sparta might train soldiers, but Olympia, that's where they showcased national identity. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, it glorified the polis he came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown superiority. City-states even funded and trained athletes as a matter of prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging in from the olive grove. They were finely tuned instruments of civic propaganda. Victories were immortalized in poems, statues, and elaborate public ceremonies. Entire cities would give free meals for life to Olympic victors because nothing says you represent our greatness like unlimited wine and lamb chops. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles, they were for flexing alliances. Political leaders used the Games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed. Marriages were negotiated. Even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce that accompanied the Games. Oh yes, the Olympic truce, or Ekaria. This was a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities during the Games so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause. Others simply ignored the memo. Sparta naturally was banned from the Games, at least once, for being too war-happy. Monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained wealth often built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or falsifying citizenship, their city's reputation suffered. And in the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece wasn't a matter of signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment, equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising amount of sand in your undercarriage. You didn't just show up at Olympia ready to run. You had to prove it. And before you even got close to the track, you were expected to survive months of punishing preparation. Athletes trained at the gymnasium, a Greek institution that was part fitness center, part temple, and part philosophy class. The word gymnasium literally means place to be naked, which tells you most of what you need to know. Training was conducted in the nude, not for shock value, but because the Greeks believed in celebrating the human form as a vessel of divine strength. Each city had its own gymnasia, but serious Olympic hopefuls traveled to Elis, the city that administered the Games. There, under the watchful eyes of officials and trainers, they endured a mandatory 30-day trial before the Olympics. No distractions, no wine, no excuses. Just relentless exercise and a diet that would make modern athletes weep. Barley bread figs, cheese, and lots of olive oil rubbed on the body, not eaten. The trainers called pietribes weren't gentle. They pushed their athletes through wrestling drills, sprinting routines, javelin throws, and strength exercises. The Greeks had no patience for slackers. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. And they meant it. Judges actually disqualified contestants before the games even started if they didn't meet the physical standard. Discipline was everything. No gym memberships, no protein shakes, no fans cheering you on from Instagram. Just the grind. Ancient athletes endured punishing heat, strict diets, and grueling repetition, all for a fleeting moment of glory, and maybe a lifetime of free meals if they won. And it wasn't just about the body. The ideal athlete was expected to have a sound mind, too. Gymnasia were also places of learning, where future champions discussed philosophy, ethics, and the meaning of arete excellence in all things. To compete in Olympia was to pursue perfection, not just victory, not just strength, but to become something closer to the gods. The sun rises over Olympia. The air is thick with incense sweat and anticipation. For 5 days, the sacred sanctuary becomes the epicenter of the Greek world. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpockets all converge for the spectacle. Today is not a normal day. Today, the gods are watching. The opening procession is a blend of ceremony and flexing. Athletes stripped bare and shining with olive oil march in a line. Spectators cheer, city-states wave banners, and judges called the Hellenodai look on with expressions that say, "We will disqualify you for blinking funny." The crowd is massive. Tens of thousands cram into the stadium, sitting on stone or dirt embankments, shaded only by the occasional olive tree and a well-placed sun hat. There are no tickets, no assigned seats, and no bathrooms worth mentioning. What there is, however, is noise. Lots of it. Shouts of support, jeers at rivals' vendors hawking wine and honey cakes, and philosophers grumbling about the decline of morals. Then the trumpet blare. The events begin. Runners launch from their marks with no starting pistol, just a loud shout, and the tension of 1,000 eyes. Wrestlers grapple in the sand, slipping in the oil and kicking up dust. Chariots race dangerously around hairpin turns in the hippodromium, where crashes are frequent and occasionally fatal. And the pancration, that's where things get downright primal. Choking, twisting, punching all in front of Zeus. Winners are crowned immediately after their events with an olive wreath from the sacred tree of Olympia. No medals, no podiums, just a loop of branches, and the roar of the crowd, but the glory eternal. Victors are celebrated like war heroes back home. Their names are etched in stone, their likeness carved in marble. And if they're lucky, a poet like Pindar will immortalize their deeds in verse long, dramatic, and extremely flattering verse. And through it all, the divine presence lingers. Offerings are made. Bulls are sacrificed. The gods are thanked. Because every leap, throw, and sprint isn't just for fame. It's an offering, a prayer made with muscle and grit. The games are over, the dust settles. The crowds pack up their amori and head home. But for a select few, those crowned with an olive wreath, life is never the same again. In ancient Greece, Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement. It was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning an Olympia meant you didn't just beat other men. You had pleased the gods. And that kind of divine favor came with serious perks. Victors returned to their pole as heroes. Statues were raised in their honor. Poets sang their praises in verses so flowery they could outshine the gardens of Aphrodite. Some cities gave their champions front-row seats at public events. Others offered free meals, for life a far better prize than a medal, especially in a world where dinner wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy patrons lined up to sponsor you. Families arranged better marriage prospects. Children were taught your name in school. And if you were from a small town, you might find your face carved on local coinage, your abs immortalized in bronze. But with fame came expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to vanish into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of a city's greatness. Some were sent on diplomatic missions, others recruited as generals. Their bodies had earned glory, and now their names had to carry it. Of course, not everyone handled the spotlight well. Some athletes grew arrogant. One famously tried to dedicate a statue to himself and the gods only for the people to quietly change the inscription. Others tried to cheat in later games, thinking their reputation would protect them. Spoiler, it didn't. Those caught bribing opponents or lying about their citizenship were fined, humiliated, and sometimes had their names wiped from records. But for the honest few, the reward was kleos, immortal fame. In Greek culture, kleos was the golden ticket. The chance to be remembered, not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. If you died young, your name lived on. If you lived long, you became a mentor, a legend, maybe even a myth. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years, without fail, even through wars and plagues. From 776 BCE onward, generation after generation of Greeks gathered at Olympia to honor the gods, chase glory, and maybe throw a javelin farther than anyone else. But even sacred traditions aren't immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had swallowed the Greek world. The games continued under Roman rule, but the original religious meaning began to fade. Romans enjoyed the spectacle, gladiators, chariots, public blood sports, but the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't translate as well when your emperor thought he was a god. Then came a final blow. In 393, CE Emperor Theodosius Theundent, recently converted to Christianity, banned all pagan festivals. That included the Olympics. After more than a millennium, the torch was snuffed out. The temples of Olympia were left to crumble. Earthquakes and floods buried what was once the heart of the Greek world. The sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived only in legend. Their stories passed down through ancient texts admired by scholars, but viewed as a relic of a vanished world, until in the 19th century, that old flame flickered back to life. Inspired by the spirit of ancient Greece and a newfound obsession with classical antiquity, a Frenchman named Baron Pierre Dubetta decided it was time to bring the games back, not in a ruined temple under olive trees, but as a modern international competition. And so, in 1896, the modern Olympic Games were born in Athens, fittingly in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, the ideals of excellence, honor, and unity, and the pursuit of something greater than victory, immortality through achievement. From nude runners in dusty fields to televised gymnastics and synchronized swimming, the Olympic journey has never been linear, but it's always been human, messy, glorious, and ever evolving. And it all began with a cook named Kroios, a foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves beneath the gaze of Zeus. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive experiment. The revolution had been won, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling government operating under the shiny new Constitution was broke, and the question on everyone's mind was going to pay for this. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, who didn't just love strong financial systems, he worshipped them. Hamilton believed the key to national strength lay in federal authority and sound fiscal policy. His plan, consolidate state debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and here's the kicker, raise revenue through taxes. And not just any taxes, a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was widely produced, widely consumed, and let's be honest, drank like water in many parts of the country, especially on the frontier, where clean water wasn't always guaranteed. Taxing whiskey was like taxing sunshine. You could count on it. But out on the western frontier, particularly in western Pennsylvania, farmers had other ideas. Many small-scale farmers didn't just drink whiskey. They made it. They turned excess grain into liquor because it was easier to transport preserved well and could be used like currency. Whiskey was liquid gold, literally. And now the federal government was reaching deep into their pockets to take a cut. Worse yet, the tax disproportionately hit small distillers, the very people scraping by with homegrown copper stills and a handful of corn. Large producers could pay a flat fee small farmers. They had to pay per gallon, and that felt like punishment by the bottle. To these men, this wasn't just a tax, it was a betrayal. The revolution had been fought over taxation, without representation, and here was a distant government in Philadelphia telling them how to run their stills. Some called it tyranny. Others called it familiar. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to defiance, and all over whiskey. To understand why Western farmers exploded over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset. Life west of the Alleghenies wasn't just hard, it was practically medieval. Roads were muddy trails, news took weeks to travel, and government was a rumor from a far-off land called Philadelphia. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Whiskey wasn't merely a drink, it was a currency, a commodity, and a cultural cornerstone. A gallon of corn whiskey could buy nails, pay wages, or trade for a pig. Taxing it felt like taxing breath itself and the federal excise tax. It hit small producers hardest, those who couldn't afford the lump sum flat fee large distillers paid. Instead, they were taxed by the gallon down to the last drop. So farmers resisted not with paperwork, but with pitchforks and musketses. At first, it was low-key civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored. Forms were left unfiled. But then came the intimidation. Officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of tar barrels and angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, resistance turned especially fierce. Collectors were harassed, threatened, or outright attacked. One was stripped, whipped and left in the woods with feathers in his hair. A frontier fashion statement with a clear message. Go home. The federal courts issued subpoenas. No one showed, Marshals tried to deliver them. Locals ran them off. By 1793, it wasn't a protest anymore. It was open non-compliance, spreading across counties like spilled mash. What made it worse, most of these people had fought in the Revolution. They had shed blood for independence. And now they were being taxed by a federal government that felt eerily similar to the monarchy they'd overthrown. "Didn't we just do this?" was the unspoken and sometimes shouted sentiment. To them, Hamilton's tax was proof that the government didn't represent them. They saw Eastern elites lining their pockets while the frontier paid the price. The whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular. It was a symbol of everything they feared about centralized power. And all the while, the government watched with increased concern. What began as lawbreaking was starting to look a lot like rebellion. By 1794, what began as scattered defiance had evolved into something far more serious, organized, armed, and determined. Western Pennsylvania was no longer just resisting the whiskey tax. It was actively challenging the federal government's right to govern at all. The flashpoint came in July 1794, when a U.S. Marshal named David Lennox and a tax inspector named John Neville, a wealthy former general, and one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to try collecting the tax, found themselves in the rebels' crosshairs. Neville had fortified his house, Bower Hill, outside Pittsburgh, preparing for trouble. Trouble, as it turned out, came in the form of several hundred armed men. The standoff began when the rebels demanded the surrender of Neville and any incriminating tax documents. He refused. Shots were fired. By the next day, a full-blown gun battle erupted. Government troops, tax resistors, and locals exchanged musket fire. Neville's house was eventually set ablaze, and 2 people were killed. The message was clear. The frontier wasn't bluffing. In the days that followed, resistance turned into mobilization. A rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men formed around Pittsburgh, calling themselves Defenders of Liberty and channeling the rhetoric of 1776. They began organizing meetings, passing resolutions, and talking about independence. Not from Britain this time, but from the eastern United States. Federal officials fled. Tax offices shut down. Pittsburgh, terrified of being burned to the ground, tried to distance itself from the rebellion. Meanwhile, word of the uprising spread quickly, sparking copycat resistance in parts of Kentucky, Virginia, and even the Carolinas. To many Americans, especially those in government, it was beginning to look like Shaw's Rebellion 2.0, but with more guns and better whiskey. What the rebels wanted wasn't entirely clear. Some called for tax repeal, others for Western independence, and a few even suggested forming a new America west of the mountains. One thing was certain, this was no longer just a tax protest. It was a challenge to the authority of the federal government under the Constitution. The rebellion raised a terrifying question. If a single region could defy a federal law with impunity, what kind of union had they really built? By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had gone from a regional disturbance to a direct threat to the authority of the Constitution itself. In the East, elites feared the collapse of federal power. In the West, rebels were talking like revolutionaries. And in the middle stood President George Washington, watching his carefully stitched republic begin to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Washington understood what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if it went unpunished, it would send a clear message. The federal government could be ignored, defied, and embarrassed. So he made a decision that stunned the young nation. He would lead the army himself. Washington became, and remains, the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had once stepped down from power, after the Revolution, this wasn't ego. It was necessity. He wanted to show that the Constitution wasn't just parchment. It had muscle. With Hamilton by his side and acting as his ever-enthusiastic second-in-command, Washington mobilized a massive force of nearly 13,000 troops, larger than the entire Continental Army at its peak. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia assembled like it was 1776 all over again. Except this time, they weren't fighting the British. They were heading west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in full military uniform, grim and deliberate. His presence was meant to intimidate, and it did. As the army marched westward, the rebels began to scatter. Many had assumed the government would stay in Philadelphia and argue over letters. They hadn't expected muskets, drums, and a president on horseback. By the time the Federal Army reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had dissolved. Leaders vanished. Local support evaporated. The show of force had worked. But Washington didn't want blood. Once the region was secured, he handed command over to General Lighor Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made. The government could and would defend its laws. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. They found silence. The rebel militias had mostly vanished into the hills, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-Axe sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion hadn't ended in bloodshed. It had ended in a retreat. But justice still had to be served, at least symbolically. Over 150 suspected rebels were arrested, many of them more confused than combative. Some were rounded up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The federal government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant, cracking down on poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason. Both had participated in the attack on Neville's estate at Bower Hill and were found guilty under the newly minted U.S. laws. And then, in a twist that perfectly captured the political complexity of the moment, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington knew something most revolutionaries turned presidents must eventually learn. Sometimes unity matters more than punishment. He had made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels might have turned them into martyrs, or worse, reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was calculated, yes, but also characteristic of his leadership style, firm, in principle, restrained in action. His goal wasn't vengeance, it was precedent. And that precedent was crystal clear. The federal government had the right to tax and the power to enforce. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, the central authority had faced a challenge and passed the test. Barely. But not everyone saw it that way. For some in the frontier regions, the rebellion confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government cared more about Eastern elites than Western farmers, that Hamilton's financial schemes served bankers, not barrel makers, that maybe, just maybe, the revolution had been for nothing. Still, the rebellion faded. The tax remained, at least for a while, but its legacy would ripple through American politics for decades. The Musketses were quiet. The rebels had dispersed. But politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority. It exposed deep fractures in the new republic's identity. And at the center of this divide were two towering figures with wildly different visions for America: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion as proof that a strong central government was not only necessary, but essential to national survival. His ideal America was industrial, urban, financially stable, and respected abroad. The show of force in Pennsylvania was to him a victory for order, a win for rule of law. But Jefferson, he saw something entirely different. Jefferson, then Secretary of State, was appalled not by the rebellion, but by Washington and Hamilton's military response. To Jefferson, and his growing base of agrarian supporters, the government had looked more like an empire than a republic. Sending 13,000 troops to confront angry farmers over a lick, a tax. That wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared that Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers, merchants, and elites. The very types who had lounged in London parlors while colonists fought at Bunker Hill. Jefferson's America was rural, decentralized, and rooted in the virtues of the independent farmer. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and James Madison began organizing opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republicans, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the Constitution, and the common man. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as mob sympathizers who turned America into France during the Reign of Terror. The rebellion, in other words, helped crystallize what had only been simmering before. America's first political parties. Lines were drawn. Newspapers took sides. The whiskey tax debate became shorthand for a larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between elite control and populist resistance. So, while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically. It became a story both sides would retell in very different ways. The Whiskey Rebellion may have fizzled on the battlefield, but in the political arena, it lit a fire that would smolder for generations. It wasn't just about whiskey or taxes anymore. It became a symbol, and like most symbols, it was wielded differently depending on who was doing the wielding. For Federalists, the rebellion was proof that the new Constitution worked. After the chaos of the Articles of Confederation, where rebellion had gone unanswered, and the government could barely afford ink, this time was different. The law was challenged, and the law responded. The peaceful dispersal of the rebels, followed by orderly trials and presidential pardons, painted a picture of mature, responsible governance. It was power restrained, not abused. To the Democratic Republicans, however, the whole affair reeked of hypocrisy. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation, and now a federal government dominated by Eastern elites had marched an army across the Appalachians to crush a protest by poor farmers. It felt less like unity and more like occupation. To them, the rebellion symbolized a government that had forgotten its roots. This ideological tug-of-war spilled into public discourse. Newspapers ran fiery editorials. Political clubs debated the meaning of liberty. Was the rebellion a dangerous echo of mob rule or a desperate cry for fairness from the margins of the republic? Even the word rebellion became contested. Federalists insisted it was a treasonous insurrection. Democratic Republicans called it civil disobedience. In time, the events of 1794 became less about what happened and more about what it meant. And looming over all of it was the Constitution itself. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first moment the federal government tested its new legal framework against real resistance and survived. It proved that the balance of federal and state power was not just theoretical. It could be enforced, but it also highlighted a reality the founders couldn't ignore. Not everyone experienced the Constitution the same way. For the elites in Philadelphia, it was protection. For the farmers of Western Pennsylvania, it was intrusion. After the smoke cleared and Washington's army marched home, the frontier returned to its usual rhythm of hard labor, hard weather, and hard liquor. The rebellion was over, at least officially. But the echoes didn't fade quickly, and neither did the resentment. Though the federal government had made its point, enforcement of the whiskey tax remained a mess. Collectors were still afraid to show their faces in the western counties. Revenue was minimal. In some regions, the tax was still completely ignored. The law existed on paper, but not in practice. And that was the irony. After all the drama, the military show of force, and the high-minded speeches about national authority, the whiskey tax barely worked. Even Alexander Hamilton, the policy's architect, began to realize it wasn't worth the cost. It had created massive political backlash, helped birth an opposition party, and stirred up anti-federal sentiment that would haunt the Federalists for years. All for a tax that didn't even bring in much revenue. Not exactly a win. Meanwhile, public opinion was shifting. The frontier wasn't just some backwards outlier. It was growing fast. More settlers were heading west. The idea of a centralized government taxing frontier livelihoods began to seem less like governance and more like a grudge. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties, he brought with him a very different philosophy. Where Hamilton had sought to build federal strength, Jefferson wanted to minimize government intrusion, especially on small farmers, and one of his first acts as president, repealing the whiskey tax. By 1802, it was gone. Just like that, the controversial tax that had sparked rebellion shaped early political identity and sent George Washington riding into battle disappeared quietly with a few strokes of a pen. No riots, no flames, just a quiet admission that sometimes power isn't worth the fight. The law had held. Yes, but the people had spoken too. And for all its symbolism, the whiskey tax ultimately proved how fragile federal authority could be when it ignored the lives of those on the margins. In our final chapter, we'll reflect on the long-term legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion and how it still echoes in today's debates over government power and protest. The musketses are long silent, the barrels empty, the tax repealed. But the legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion still lingers, aged like the liquor that sparked it. At first glance, it may seem like a footnote in the vast story of the early republic. A regional dispute, attacks gone wrong, a brief flicker of armed protest. But look closer, and you'll see a moment that encapsulates a profound national dilemma. Who holds power, and how far will people go to resist it? The rebellion forced the country to answer uncomfortable questions. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Yes. But would doing so fracture the very unity it sought to preserve? Also, yes. It highlighted the delicate balance between law and liberty and showed that a republic doesn't run on paper alone. It runs on perception, participation, and trust. Washington's decision to ride out with the army wasn't just a flex. It was an act of symbolism, a demonstration that the Constitution was more than ink and ideals. But Jefferson's later repeal of the tax showed the flip side of that coin. Federal power must also listen, not just lead. In that tension between enforcement and empathy lies the DNA of American politics. Over time, the Whiskey Rebellion became a case study in governance. Scholars cite it when discussing federal authority, the limits of protest, or the birth of American political parties, and modern debates about taxation, rural disenfranchisement, and federal overreach. They echo this story with eerie familiarity. Even culturally, the rebellion remains potent. It's the only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It sparked political movements, shifted national dialogue, and challenged the boundaries of dissent in a young democracy. In many ways, the rebellion wasn't about whiskey at all. It was about who gets heard when the government makes decisions that affect everyday lives. Today, the story of the Whiskey Rebellion serves as both warning and reminder that even in a democracy, laws must earn their legitimacy and power must be wielded with care. The line between governance and provocation is razor thin, and sometimes it runs straight through a glass of corn mash. History may have aged the whiskey, but the rebellion, it still burns.